Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Brookings India. My name is Dhruva Jayashankar. I'm a fellow for foreign policy here. And it's my pleasure to be introducing a good friend and a former colleague. We used to work together, actually, Bruce Stokes, who is at the Pew Research Center, who, just like last year, and we did an event like this last year, he is here to present the findings of their annual India poll. I just want to stress before handing over the mic to Bruce to go over this year's survey results, just highlight in some ways why this is so important. It's quite common sitting here in Delhi when something like demonetization happens or the GST comes into force, for people to pronounce what this means for the common man. And yet quite often we don't bother to stop and ask the common man himself or herself what they're thinking. Similarly, on foreign policy, we sometimes hear people pronounce things, well, India thinks this, Indians don't like Pakistan, Indians do like Russia. Again, we don't often know. That's certainly reflective sometimes of an elite opinion, in the capital particularly, but we don't always know for sure. And finally, we don't always get a good sense of the popularity of our leaders, except on election day. Even recently I saw an article in the news that compared Rahul Gandhi's popularity with Narendra Modi's based on how many retweets their tweets got, which is not a particularly scientific or effective way of measuring public opinion, if for no other reason than the fact that a very small fraction of Indians are actually on Twitter. So for all of these reasons, whether it's domestic politics, whether it's the state of the economy, whether it is foreign policy, we don't often have a good sense of what average Indians are thinking. There are a lot of polls, and you see these in the news, that are conducted by Indian polling agencies, but many of them are quite limited. Many of them are only done in urban centers. Many of them are only done online. And so I think one of the things that really distinguishes the Pew surveys, all of the Pew surveys from others, is that they're face-to-face interviews. They're done across the country, and I think Bruce will speak a little bit about the methodology used. But as a result, they're able to get much more accurate, an accurate sense of Indian public opinion. And amongst other things, I think in 2014, prior to the last general election, it was actually the Pew survey that confidently predicted and turned out to be accurate the degree to which the BJP won that election. I think many people were quite confident the BJP would win that election, but not the degree. So in any case, with that sort of overview, and I think why this survey is important, let me turn it over to Bruce.
Dhruva, thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here, and I really want to thank Brookings India for this kind invitation. I really enjoyed our conversation last year, so I'm looking forward to your comments and questions and even suggested questions for what we should be asking next year, because we, as Dhruva said, this is an annual survey we do in India as part of our global surveys that we do. And we are always trying to improve them and trying to be as useful in terms of contributing to the public dialogue in India and around the world about India through our surveys. Briefly, just to explain what the Pew Research Center is, we're based in Washington. We are nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy. I always like to joke, I can tell you we discovered 1 + 1 + 1, but I can't tell you it equals 3. You'll have to make that conclusion for yourself. But more importantly, we firmly believe that good public policy flows from good information. And I know that's a fairly quaint idea these days in the era of fake news, but we actually do believe that we need to listen to the publics and try to understand where they're coming from as a way of informing public policy debates. We're funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, which is one of those wonderful old American foundations that is committed to listening to the people. We do a range of, maybe go back for a minute, we do a range of topics, everything from Hispanics in America to religion around the world, to work on science and technology, extensive public opinion polling surveying in the United States, and we do a survey of about 40 countries a year around the world, and have done so since 2002. So there's a raft of information on our website. It's free. Most importantly, it's searchable, so that if you're at all doing any research on anything from India to other countries and wonder whether anybody's ever asked them about a particular topic, I highly recommend the website, because there's a lot of good data on there. The survey we did in India was done in February and March of this year. I say that because obviously the context is important, but I would also warn you not to overestimate the context. We did this after demonetization, but before the GST and before the slight slowdown in the Indian economy. You'll see from the results that demonetization did not seem to have much of an impact on public opinion. While I know that some of you may think, well, gee, the GST did have a lot of effect on public opinion. Well, maybe it did and maybe we didn't. We don't know. But again, just as we should not overestimate the impact of these things, we don't underestimate them either. We'll wait and see next year what the survey shows us. We do this face-to-face in India. We do it in 16 of the 18 most populous states. There's a couple of states we don't survey in for security reasons. We stand by our results. The Economist calls us the gold standard in global public opinion survey research, and we take that very, very seriously. But I would be the first to admit to you, as a pollster, you're only as good as your last survey. So we'll see whether the results of this survey stands up, and hopefully the next one will too. The key takeaways are: one, the favorability of the Prime Minister is extraordinarily high. Nearly 9 in 10 Indians have a favorable view of the Prime Minister. This is buoyed by the fact that people have a growing sense of confidence in the economy, and an even more rapidly growing sense that the direction of the country is going in the right direction. We ask people about do they trust the government. Overwhelmingly, people trust the government, and overwhelmingly they like Indian democracy. I can tell you these findings are both correlated to how people feel about the direction of the economy and the direction of the country. So they reflect each other. We also ask in India and all over the world every year about attitudes towards the United States and attitude toward and confidence in the U.S. president. As you can see, confidence in the U.S. president has gone down. I believe that is, if my math is correct, 18 percentage points in the last year between confidence in Obama and confidence in Trump. Now, 18 percentage points sounds like a lot. It is a lot. But I will tell you that the drop in confidence in the U.S. president in India is dwarfed by the drop in confidence in other countries. The drop in confidence in the U.S. president in Sweden is 83 percentage points in 1 year. The drop in confidence in Germany is 75 percentage points in 1 year. In both Japan and the UK, it's 50+ percentage points in 1 year. So the 18 percentage point drop in India, which is not insignificant, as I say, needs to be seen in context. Similarly, there's a drop in favorability of the US, but it is not nearly as steep as the drop in favorability of the US in parts of Europe and other places. In fact, just as an aside, the only place where you've seen a dramatic improvement in the favorability of the US and in confidence in the US president is, guess where? Russia. Anyway, moving on. We ask people in India and all over the world, is life better for people like you today than it was 50 years ago. Overwhelmingly, by a 4-to-1, basically, people in India say, yes, life is better than it was in 1967, basically. Now, frankly, if people had said otherwise, I think it would have been a surprise. In fact, I'm not quite sure what this 17% who say things are worse are thinking. Be interesting to have done focus groups with them to figure out why they thought it was worse. But we see this all over the emerging market world, that basically people say, look, things are better than they were 50 years ago, and I think indisputably they are. I would note as an aside, we asked this question in the United States right before the 2016 election, and Trump voters said things were worse, and Clinton voters said things were better. So it's not universal that people believe that, and these findings do have political consequences. We, as I said, ask people about India's direction. How are things going in the country today? As you can see, there's been this steady and very sharp rise, more than a doubling in support for the direction of the country since 2013. There's absolutely no disagreement among various demographic groups about India's economic situation. Overwhelmingly, all groups believe that the economy is doing well, including 3/4 of Congress Party supporters who acknowledge that the economy is doing well. When you ask people, are your children likely to be better off than you are? Again, you see no significant departures between demographic groups. I can tell you, as an aside, one of the interesting findings of our global survey is that people in Europe, Japan, and the United States do not believe that their children are going to be better off than they are. We don't have long-term data on this question, so I can't tell you when that changed, but certainly the literature believes, or if you read the literature, it suggests that people in the West have always believed that their kids were going to be better off than they are, and then you'd work to make that happen. We don't know what the effect is going to be in societies where if in fact it becomes permanent that people believe the golden age is behind us, not ahead of us, what that means. But clearly in India and other emerging markets, people believe the golden age is still ahead. So that would, you would think, affect people's savings and investment patterns in the present, as that has in the past in the West. We ask people, it's not that the Indians don't believe there are problems facing Indian society. Far from it. In fact, we asked people, we gave them a list, and they could tell us whether they thought these domestic problems were a very big problem, somewhat of a problem, or no problem at all. And what's interesting in survey work, when you ask people a question and you give them 3 options, they tend to gravitate to the middle option because they aren't really sure, so they gravitate. When you ask people, though, about problems, they tend to gravitate to the very big category. It's almost as if you ask people, you give them people a chance to vent, and they will vent. Everything is a problem, a very big problem. So this is only the very big responses, because literally if we ask people, if you combine the very big and somewhat big, you'd get over 90% for every one of these things. So this shows a certain degree of intensity. In other words, how bad do you think these problems are? People are most worried about crime. They're second most worried about terrorism and corruption. What is interesting is the lack of availability of cash for daily transactions, the demonetization effect. 45% say it's a very big problem. Now, so that's not insignificant, but relative to other concerns that the public has, it's actually a very low concern. So I think we need to see demonetization in some kind of context. It is interesting that BJP supporters seem to be more worried about corruption than Congress supporters. I can't tell you why, but when you look at the demographics in response to those questions, that's what you find. We ask Indians, as we do in other countries often, about various institutions. Yeah. If we can move to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. We ask people about various institutions in the society, in part just to understand institutional alienation, which you certainly see in places like the United States. The most popular institution in Indian society is the military. 62% of the public say the military has a very good influence on the country. I can tell you the most popular institution in the United States is the military as well. What is interesting is that 54% of Indians say the national government has a good influence on the country. That is up from 29% in 2014. You can make your own guess as to why it's changed so dramatically, but obviously something has happened between 2014 and today. You have a new government, and you have a very popular leader of that government. It's also interesting that there's a huge partisan gap on the national government's influence with BJP supporters much more likely to say that it has a very good influence than Congress supporters say. Support for the media is actually down from 55% in 2015 to 39% today. As a former member of the media myself, I don't find that encouraging, but you can make your own judgments. We ask people beyond the question about how they felt about Indian democracy, which remember they felt very good about Indian democracy. We then ask people in India and in all 38 countries we surveyed this year, we ask them about various forms of governance. And you could support all of these forms. It wasn't an either or. And as you can see, 3/4 of Indians said that they thought representative democracy was a good way to govern the country. But 3/4 of Indians also supported having the public, rather than elected officials, vote directly on major issues facing the country. Bear in mind, India has never had a national referendum. But I can tell you, you're not alone. A median of 70% in Europe want more direct votes on major issues. They want more referenda, basically. 2/3 of Japanese want more referenda. They've never had a referenda either in their history of their country. We don't know how long-standing this faith in direct democracy is in India or other places, because we've never asked the question before. But I do think it's something to ponder, that there seems to be such an interest and support in direct democracy, not only in countries where people feel pretty good about the leadership, but in countries where they don't feel good about the leadership. I can kind of analyze, well, if you don't feel good about the current leadership, maybe you want to take control of the democracy yourself. But in India, people want more direct democracy, even though they feel good about the leadership. The implications of this we don't know, but it's certainly something I think to pay attention to, because it certainly would be a new departure for democracy, modern democracy. We also, though, asked people about non-democratic forms of governance. And here is where the results in India stand out compared to the rest of the world. We asked people about rule by experts. Should experts, rather than elected officials, make the major decisions affecting the country? I can confess to you, we actually thought of asking this because we knew that in America and in parts of Europe, experts were really being degraded and weren't respected anymore, and we wanted to see what people thought about that. Well, in fact, that is the case in the United States and parts of Europe. It's not the case in emerging markets. In emerging markets and developing countries all over the world, there's still a reverence for expertise, including in India, where 65% of the public say rule by experts is not a bad idea. India is one of only 7 countries, however, where more than 60% of the population supports rule by experts. So that's a very high percentage of Indians compared to the rest of the world who say this. We ask about rule by a strong leader, and I would point out to you the question is not a strong leader who speaks his mind and gives a good speech. We actually in the question say a leader who rules without interference by the parliament or by the courts. And 55% of Indians said, that sounds like a good way to run the government. That's the highest percentage of any of the 38 countries where we asked the question. So there's more support for a strong leader, I dare say an authoritarian leader in India than in any other country that we surveyed. And finally, we asked people about a rule by the military. How would you feel if the military ruled the country? 53% of Indians said that sounds like a good way to run the country. That's one of only 4 countries in our survey where a majority of the population said this is a good idea. I would point out to you as an aside, 17% of Americans think rule by military is a good idea, and 22% of Americans think that rule by a strong leader is a good idea, just to give you some context there. This is the breakdown by partisanship in terms of these various forms of governance. In each case, BJP supporters are more supportive of each one of these options than are Congress supporters. But notice there's a 22 percentage point difference between how BJP supporters feel about rule by experts and how Congress supporters feel about rule by experts. There's a 20 percentage point difference between how BJP supporters feel about rule by a strong leader compared to the way Congress people feel about rule by a strong leader. To go back to where we started, to break down some of these views on Prime Minister Modi and some of his rivals, Modi's popularity is at 88% in this survey. It's up from 81% in 2016. It's up from 87% in 2015, so it kind of dipped a little bit and then went back up. But when you have the support of 8 in 10 people, I'm not sure you can call that a dip. Rahul Gandhi's favorability was 63% in 2016. It's now 58%. That's really about the margin of error, so I wouldn't make a great deal about that shift. What is interesting is that in 2015, Arvind Kejriwal's support was 60%. And bear in mind, this was a nationwide survey. We do this survey in rural and urban areas. We do it all over India. We do it in 8 languages. So he was a quite popular person as recently as 2015. Only 39% have a favorable view of him today. And so his decline is actually paralleled by the decline in support for the AAP, whereas there hasn't been that much change in support for Congress or the BJP. If you look at the favorability of Modi across demographic groups, there's really not much difference. There is a partisan difference, but even 65% of Congress supporters express a favorable view of the Prime Minister. What is interesting is that not only do 89% of 18 to 29-year-olds have a favorable view of Modi, but 72% of that 89% have a very favorable view of Modi. So the intensity of his support among young people is actually quite strong. Not surprisingly, there is a partisan difference on Modi. 97% of BJP people have a favorable view of the Prime Minister. Only 65% of Congress party supporters have a favorable view. And when you ask people about how the Prime Minister is handling various problems, domestic problems facing the country, for example, 72% approve of the way he's handling unemployment, but that is 81% of BJP supporters, but only 46% of Congress supporters. So there are some huge and probably not unexpected partisan judgments on how he's handling things. Again, here's just the demographic breakdown of this. There are some differences, but overwhelmingly they tend to be not that great. Move to the next one. We asked Indians about how they thought the Prime Minister was handling various aspects of international affairs. In this case, how is he handling relations with other major countries? The first thing I think we have to remember in looking at public opinion in India about international issues is you consistently get very high don't knows. I mean, bear in mind, we are going out to rural Rajasthan. We are asking farmers in the middle of nowhere, how do you think the prime minister is dealing with Japan? Now, he may not even have heard of the word Japan. He may not know what you're talking about. And so you tend to get 40 to 50% don't knows in responses to questions about international affairs. So we have to take some of these results with a grain of salt. That very same farmer will have very strong opinions about the prime minister himself. He'll have very strong opinions about rising prices or about the direction of the country. It's just that international affairs are not necessarily part of his ken. And I think we just have to remember that. Nevertheless, I think it's interesting to know, among those people who have an opinion, how do they feel? Basically, a majority believe he's handling relations with the U.S. well. Now, it's down from 66% last year who said he was handling things well. I would caution you not necessarily to read too much into that, because bear in mind, and again, one of the dirty little secrets of public opinion research is, you need to read the question. The question is, how is the prime minister handling relations with the United States? And you have to put yourself in the mind of the respondent. Now, what is the respondent responding to? The prime minister's name or the United States? We know the prime minister is very popular. We know there's declining popularity of the United States. So how the prime minister is handling the United States, the response may in part reflect more a judgment on the United States than it does on the prime minister, even though the question is very straightforward. But again, you just have to realize that it's important to read the question and try to understand maybe how the person heard the question, if you can. By the way, the attitudes towards Russia or China or Pakistan have not changed much from last year, not in any significant way. We ask Indians more broadly about how they view the world. We ask them what they consider to be the top global threats facing India. We do this every year. Basically, Indians believe that the terrorist group ISIS poses the biggest threat to India. More significantly, that concern is up 14 percentage points in the last year. So this is very much on people's minds, or at least it was when we asked the question. About half the Indian public is concerned about climate change. That is something we found consistently over time. Just as an anecdote, when a couple of years ago, before the Paris climate change conference, I was briefing the French ambassador and her team who were actually running the conference. And I pointed out to them that a majority of Indians wanted progress at the Paris conference on climate change. And she looked up at me and she said, "That's not what the Indian government is telling me." So there is some value in public opinion research to act as a check on maybe some of the assertions of governments. It is interesting that only 19% of Indians believe that U.S. power and influence is a threat to India. 19% also say it's no threat at all. That's very low. 62% of Japanese say U.S. power and influence is a threat to Japan. Again, one of the limitations of survey research, you don't know what the respondent was thinking when you asked them a question. I can't imagine the Japanese think we're about to invade Japan. They might be thinking that these guys are going to get us into a war. Maybe that's what they're thinking. We don't know. But Indians in our survey are much more worried about the power and influence of China than they are about the power and influence of the United States. And they equally are not that concerned about Russia's power and influence. We ask people about their views of various countries. Again, the view of the U.S. has gone down, but other countries haven't changed. As part of our survey that we do every year, we often ask about the attributes of the U.S. president. You know, we're trying to get at why people have confidence or don't have confidence in the U.S. president. As you can see, the don't knows are very high. I mean, basically, most Indians haven't thought much about the personality of the U.S. president. But among those attributes that we ask, basically 4 in 10 Indians think he's a strong leader and they think he's qualified to be president. Only 28% say he's dangerous. I say only 28% because the median in the other 37 countries is 62%. Only 26% say President Trump is arrogant. The median around the world is 75% who say he's arrogant. And only 17% say President Trump is intolerant. The median around the world is 65%. So relative to other public views of the U.S. president, Indians are more positively disposed than many other publics, including, frankly, some of the Americans we surveyed. When you compare attitudes towards the U.S. to China, Indians feel better about the U.S. in all measures. So that I think is interesting. Although the percentage of Indians who say the U.S. is the world's leading economic power is down 9 percentage points in the last year. Now, I will warn you, that number around the world tends to jump up and down based on based on underlying economic issues. I mean, you can't explain it by just GDP growth or whatever, but it tends to be one of the more volatile indicators that we have. And India was pretty volatile this year, went down 9 percentage points. We ask people about Chinese military power and economic power. It's growing. You feel good or bad about that. Basically, Indians think both of those things are bad for India. There's been an uptick in unfavorable opinion towards Pakistan in India. 72% now have an unfavorable view, including 64% have a very unfavorable view. And finally, we ask people, do you think the Indian government should use more or less force, military force, than it does now in Kashmir? Basically, 63% of the public supports more military force. I regret the fact we never asked this question before, so I don't know whether 63% is up or down from the past. It's just there seems to be strong support for more military force in Kashmir. So thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions. Let's open this up.
Before I open it up to questions, just a few comments just based on the results, and I'm actually looking at it compared to last year's results, which I think is, I mean, the thing with surveys is, particularly if the methodology is consistent, the most interesting thing about it is the trend lines rather than the overall figures. I suspect the 2 things that will get the most attention, and I actually haven't had a chance to scan the media today, and I believe there's a lot of media coverage of this poll this morning. One, of course, is the Prime Minister's popularity rating. And 2, I suspect, is the very positive views on the direction of the economy, the direction of the country and stuff, particularly the fact that this poll was conducted a few months after demonetization. But barring that, I think there are 5 things that stand out as slightly surprising to me, or at least interesting results to me. One is, and I think, let me take these in sort of order of what is possibly interesting. One is actually, if you look at what issues Indians identified as problematic, 4 of those issues have actually seen a bit of a decline in the last year, and I guess I'm a bit intrigued by that. One is lack of unemployment opportunities. Last year, 81% said that this was a very big problem. This year, 73% said. That's an 8% drop, so not insignificant, but not. 2, corrupt officials. Last year, 80% said it was a big problem. This year, 74%, a 6% drop. The third, surprisingly, is air pollution. Last year, 68% said it was a very big problem. This year, 54%. I don't know, maybe if the poll was done today, it would be different. And finally, communal relations. Last year, 54% said this was a very big problem. This year, 37%. That's a 17% drop. So for whatever reason, and I'm not sure I can explain it, we have seen a drop. Perhaps this has to do with the direction, the overall direction of the country. I'm not sure, but that I think is sort of an interesting result of this year's survey. Secondly, there are some intriguing differences between BJP and Congress supporters. One was their views of the economy were slightly off, although, as Bruce mentioned, Congress supporters still seem to be largely positive on the economy. But I think also, interestingly, the strong ruler, and particularly attitudes towards the military. And I mean, I know this was the way the question was framed was as military rule, but I wonder whether their overall attitudes towards the military, which are different amongst supporters of the two parties. Three, I think while the overall political trends were not surprising, and I think the biggest highlight was the drop, it seems, in overall national popularity of Arvind Kejriwal, at the Congress holding steady, the BJP still being quite high. But I think the youth vote was actually very interesting. In the next general election in 2019, we will have voters for the first time who were born after the year 2000, which is kind of mind-boggling for me. And these are not just millennial voters. I mean, these are really almost post-millennial voters. And the very high intensity of the lower end of that demographic, the 18 to 29, suggests that the new voters coming, who will be first-time voters in 2019, may very well be quite positively disposed towards the BJP. On a less heartening note, I mean, it seemed also that it was youth voters who were more in favor of a more hardline posture on Kashmir, that is the use of military force. I think there was one slide you had up, which was interesting about the youth and the use of force. I mean, I think that there's some interesting takeaways there, possibly. Four, the issues on democracy. There's this interesting, I think a lot of polls show an interesting contradiction amongst voters. We did a survey, we were part of a survey that was launched in May or June of this year, and it showed a very interesting, some interesting contradictions. On the one hand, Indians overwhelmingly believed that India was a great power. Overwhelmingly, I mean, more than people in other countries believed in India's great power. At the same time, when asked the question, do you believe it is in India's interest to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, a very high number of Indians said no. More than in most other countries, more than Japan, for example. And so there's this interesting contradiction, it seems, in Indian public opinion. On the one hand, you want all the benefits of being a great power, but you don't want any of the risks or costs associated with it. And similarly, I think that view on democracy, I had known that Indians had a very high view of military rule and strong leader rule. I mean, that itself was not surprising. But I think it was somewhat encouraging that at the same time, overwhelmingly, Indians have faith in democracy of some variety. This actually tracks with the poll that we did, which 8 out of 10, we asked people to rank how important democracy was to them personally on a scale of 1 to 10, and the average was 8.1, I believe, and that average was very consistent across age groups. So young, youth had the same view as older, which was again not true of. We did this poll in 6 countries. It was not true of any of the other countries. There were very sharp age differentials in responses to that question. Finally, while most of the opinions of international affairs, the changes in terms of the handling of relations with the US, China, and Russia are consistent with last year. They're all within the margin of error, so I wouldn't read any change. What is interesting is that the negatives on the Prime Minister's handling of relations with Pakistan is down 6 points. The positives haven't changed, but the negatives are down from are down quite a bit. And this is, interestingly enough, this is the first survey done after the surgical strikes. So while it's interesting, while it doesn't seem to have had an effect on positive views of the Indian government's handling of Pakistan, it possibly it may have a correlation with a slight depreciation in the negative views on handling of Pakistan. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight those. Those were at least some of the things that stood out to me.